Today is the 23rd of December 2017, and this is a conversation between Emilio Longo and Allan R. Banks. So, hello Allan, how are you?
I'm just fine. How are you?
Good, thanks, Allan. So I would like to get straight into it, if that's all right.
Sure.
I would like to begin right from the beginning. So from your early exposures of art into your training, and basically stories affiliated with your training and such. So can you tell me a little bit about your early exposures to figurative art?
Well, I was always into art from the time I could, hold a pencil or brush.
Mm,
So from a very early age, I would say 3 or 4, I was always doodling and drawing. Didn't realize that other people didn't do it.
mm-hmm.
Um, as time went along, uh, through junior high school and so forth, I was intensely interested in the old masters. At that time, without a computer and other things that we have today,
Mm-hmm.
the knowledge was largely through libraries. So I
Sure.
would frequent the libraries and you'd run into books on Michelangelo or Da Vinci, the general old masters.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, they'd also throw in the more modern, what they call masters, which I rejected then and I reject today, which is the Picassos of the world and
Mm-hmm.
Cezanne and so forth, which I had very little use for. I really wanted to understand the discipline of art. Um, as I grew up through junior high school and high school, um, I was even able at that time to sell work um, through the school. Actually, got me through school pretty well as well.
Wow.
Where I would take a class, maybe I wasn't the greatest at whatever the subject might have been, but they would say, "Allan, just draw something for our library or for the school. You'll do fine." So early on, I was interested in the business of art as well as art, but I also knew from the time I was around 15, I visited the Detroit Institute of Art, and I could see the incredible masterpieces. I was largely interested in Dali, Salvador Dali,
Mm-hmm.
because it's the only sort of realist painter working with a figure that I was aware of
Yeah.
on a contemporary level.
Sure. Sure.
But then I ran into in the museum the work of Bouguereau,
Mm.
Jerome, and the academics, and I was just absolutely floored.
Yeah.
So that's what got me interested at a very early age, around 15, 14, somewhere in through there, when I would visit the museum. And later on, when I went to art school, which was just a couple blocks from the institute.
Mm-hmm.
And also, they had a great library, which had books, older books on the academic tradition.
Yeah.
And that's where I ran across R.H.I.'s Gamble's book, was when I was in art school.
Wow.
And
Yeah. And that
once I read,
was, sorry, Alan, that was Gamma's book Twilight of Painting, right?
exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And that changed my whole world.
Sure.
I didn't realize he was still alive at the time, but I would check the book out month after month. I wrote it down. In those days, it was, everything was handwritten. There was no
Yeah.
easy way of doing things. But I had no idea he was still alive.
Yeah.
But eventually, I ran across the article in American Artist magazine about Richard Lack, who had
Mm-hmm.
worked with R.H.I.'s Gamble. And what interested me was the fact that it was such disciplined art.
Yeah.
Even earlier than that, when I was in art school, just to back up a little bit about the art world at that point,
Mm-hmm.
was I made some trips with a friend of mine to New York in
Yeah.
search of the possibility of finding a well-trained painter, teacher painter at the Art Students League or somewhere else, and I was just not impressed at all.
Yeah.
I had the friend of mine that I went with was also had a scholarship because he was older than I was, about 3 years,
Mm-hmm.
and we met in art school. And he went into the service, came back, and he was doing some life drawings in the same class I was, and we hit it off. And he had studied with Brackman and a few other people at the Art Students
Mm.
League. But the problem that I had was they simply didn't have the skill set that I was looking for, and so that's where I became interested in Gamble. I read his book, and then that led me to Lack.
Sure. Sure. Okay. So just to back up for a second there, Alan. So you attended the Society of Arts and Crafts in 1966. Is that right?
That's correct. And at that time, that school was by portfolio only, so there were a lot of people that did not get in.
Mm.
Um, the interesting thing about it was, even during that time of just extreme modernism, and where they just literally scoffed at people who were like Sargent or any of the representational painters. But it didn't sway me at all. I have a very one-track mind, a very stubborn personality. So when I forgot the question already.
So I was just asking if your first art school was at the Society of Arts and Crafts, and that was in 1966.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and it was a modernist art school.
Yeah, but the beauty of it was there was one teacher there who had some rudimentary disciplines that I did pick up some really good tips on the flow of the figure,
Yeah.
which I always retained. The other thing was that they had a fantastic life class and a costume life class. I got rid of all the other classes that were just fillers. And mind you, that was during the Vietnam War. So as soon as you just changed your curriculum in any way, you were subject to the draft.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it was a very tumultuous time during the 60s, as you know, not from your own experience, but from, history. So there's just a lot of interesting things that were happening that were just on the forefront, artistically speaking. And I was, in some ways, with a couple of my friends, I had 3 other pals at the school. One of them went with me to LAX. And we were just very hard-nosed about sticking to what Gamble had proposed, and it eventually worked out.
Fantastic. So at that time, so Gamble's book inspired you, and you were also inspired by the work of the graduates from Paris's École des Beaux-Arts. How did you come to find the actual work from students that were studying in your école? Was that through books?
Yeah, but actually the Detroit Institute of Arts had a fantastic collection of academic work, John Singer Sargent's work, William Merritt Chase. It was just an extensive collection. Unfortunately, Detroit itself is just kind of a rundown city. The management seemed to take care of it. But the cultural history of those places at the turn of the century, they collected some really fine work.
Sure.
So I was able to really absorb early on what I knew I wanted to learn. I mean, you could just look at the work and be so impressed.
Yeah.
So my quest from the art school days was to find somebody I could actually study with who had that degree of skill or close to it.
Sure. So from there, so you met Richard Lack. So did you say, Alan, that your friend told you that Richard Lack was training students?
No, he was in a article in American Artist magazine.
Okay, yeah.
And oddly enough, I picked up the magazine just one day and happened to rummage through it, 1970, I think it was, and saw that he was putting together a school. And I was so impressed with the work and the fact that he worked with Gamble.
Yeah.
So I called within of, I think, 2 weeks, and I said, look, I know all about Gamble, and I had a ton of life drawings, which were pretty impressive. And he said, well, let me take a look. Why don't you send them along? I've got at that time, he said he had just numerous inquiries about getting into his classes because he would only take a handful of people.
Yeah.
And so I heard from him about within a few weeks after I sent the drawings, and he interviewed me on the phone. And then he said, well, why don't you come up and visit me in Minneapolis, and let's see if this is a good fit for you and a good fit for him, So fortunately, he thought I was okay.
Great. And so tell me about your first meeting. What do you remember from that first initial meeting with Richard Lack?
It was pretty interesting, actually, because Lack has got a wonderful speaking voice, and he was tall and very gentlemanly. And I pulled up with my car, and I forget, we were close to some kind of eating establishment. And then he met me there, and we shook hands, and he said, well, let's go have a bite to eat and get acquainted, and that's the way it started.
Wow. Incredible. Okay, so from there, you were accepted into his school, and how long were you trained in Atelier Lack for?
About 4 years.
4 years.
And that included the summer, so we didn't take any time off, at least I didn't.
Wow. So it was full time. But how did you support yourself during those years?
Well, what happened was you're given me a lot of interesting questions because it fills in what I would otherwise forget.
Sure.
What happened was when I was still in Michigan, and before I had actually called LAC, I
Mm-hmm.
had applied for a grant through the Elizabeth T. Greenshields Foundation.
Yep.
And as it turned out, I became a finalist.
Okay.
And so during that time where they were going back and forth with me as far as from being a finalist to actually being granted an award,
Mm-hmm.
what happened was I then met LAC. I went up to see him, and when I was accepted into his school, I got another letter from the Greenshields Foundation saying, "We're happy to say that you are actually one of the people we've selected to win an award." And so
Great.
LAC, this is interesting. LAC through, let me see, let me back up in a second. Gamble is the one who actually set up the Elizabeth T. Greenshields Foundation
Is that
years
right?
early. Yeah, which was just a weird coincidence.
Yeah.
And so when I went to Lax, he said, "Well, let me call them because I want to make sure that you're a shoe-in on this because it'll help you financially to get through that couple of years there, you know."
Sure.
And so that's kind of how that aspect evolved.
Fantastic. Okay, so take me inside Atelier Lac. So, what was the actual environment like? How many students were there? What was the curriculum like?
There were just seven of us. My friend Gary, who was also from Michigan, followed me a few months after that because
Hmm.
he wanted us to have two. He and I had two rather rough and tumble Detroit guys.
Mm.
So we were there together, and so there were seven of us total, and that's really all he wanted.
Seven.
Um,
Wow.
and
Yeah.
so we, it was like being in heaven. Actually, it was setting up a model. We started with cast drawing, of course,
Hmm.
and I actually, when I first got there, went to his personal studio
Mm.
um, and worked from the cast almost alongside of him. I would have the model who would pose for figures for LAC. I would drive her in from where I was and the school to his home, and he had a beautiful studio there.
Yeah.
And he would be working from the model sort of next to me. He had a good sized studio, and I'd be working in the corner on the cast.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that happened for a few months, and then you go from that to working on still life. He also had me put away my brushes during that time because he didn't want me to get too ahead of his teaching.
Okay.
So it was very disciplined, but I loved it. You know, I still painted, but I did on the sly, which
Hmm.
he was fine with that. But I did sketches of the people in the studio in black and white
Hmm.
because part of our exercises when we were there is he would pick a theme either from the Bible or mythology, and he'd want us to do a composition from our head. If you wanted to use models, you could, but about I think, a 10 by 12 black and white picture. It could be a charcoal or it could be a black and white painting.
Yeah.
And he would okay it, and it was sort of like going into the salon, or I
Mm.
mean, I say the Academy Julian.
Mm.
So that beginning was pretty interesting, and then we went from there to from still life to hiring models for portrait and the figure, and that was the rest of the curriculum.
Fantastic. What a privilege. And so, would you say you spent about a year just in drawing, or did you start painting from that initial first year of training?
Well, I was a little bit rebellious. I was always going out, especially in the summertime when we didn't have an official school,
Mm.
but he had us use the studio. So I took advantage of doing landscape painting, and I would show him. And I also did copies. I did a copy of Bouguereau that was in the Minneapolis Museum of Art,
Yeah.
and I think I did one other. I can't remember, but I did a lot of research at the museums. I'm a museum, what would you call it, aficionado.
Yeah.
I just can't stay away from looking at fine work.
I think we
So
all have that problem.
yeah, exactly.
Okay. So one thing I find really fascinating about the curriculum at Atelier Lac is that Richard Lac didn't use the Barg Jerome drawing course. Is that right?
He didn't use what?
The Charles Barg and Jean-Léon Jerome drawing course, the plates.
Well, at that time they weren't around.
Yeah, they weren't
They
around.
they may have been around somewhere, but we didn't see them.
You didn't see him, okay.
No,
So,
because the
so
publication of those was much later for me.
yeah, yeah, sure. So you started from drawing from the round then, drawing from the casts.
we drew from the guests, and then also we did the compositional things. We did the life drawings and paintings. We got into painting as the last part of that. And we then hired models. Gary and I both used a ballerina. There was a ballerina school below us.
Mm.
So we used the models there because they're hams anyway.
Mm. What was Gary's surname? Or is Gary's surname?
Hoffman.
Okay, I've heard of him before, yeah. Sure.
Yeah, he's a very fine painter. He's living in Boston at the moment.
Great, fantastic. Okay, so what year was it when you finished your training with Richard Lack?
Right around 1974.
74. Okay,
Yeah.
okay, right. So upon graduating, you moved to Ohio, is that right? And you opened up a studio and started teaching?
Yeah. Well, I was married and I had a little child. She was actually born in Minneapolis.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened was, as I was going back and forth, because my wife was spending more time with her folks, that I really missed being around my daughter.
Yeah.
So that kind of lured me back to Ohio. But actually, I had gotten what I needed from LAC,
Mm-hmm.
and I had discussed with him whether I should stick around in Minneapolis or, return home, because there was a possibility I could teach or do some other things.
Mm-hmm.
And he says he preferred that I pioneer, as he called it, other areas.
Sure.
And so when I went to Ohio, I quickly tried to find a little studio building, and I went to a couple of local galleries where they were hosting some classes. And when they saw my work, and I gave them a little talk, I said I'm opening up a studio, etc. And if anybody would like to study, they're welcome to. And that obviously would pay some of my bills.
Mm-hmm.
And then I launched into doing portraits, which I at that time it was very shaky, because you have to remember it was mostly modernism that was in vogue.
Yeah.
So people doing, believe it or not, portraits was, people would say, do they actually do that today?
Mm.
So you can see how things have changed over the years.
Yes, of course. Did you have a name for your school?
Yeah. Well, at first I didn't. It was just my Allan Banks, studio.
Sure.
Actually, Carl Sampson was a protege of mine. He became a very fine artist and
Yeah.
also studied.
Yeah, sure.
But
So-
anyway, after that, I moved back, and I got into doing the classes and also some portrait work. That's where I got more into the business of art as well, as you see in my bio there.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So just to go back to your school for a second, so at its peak, how many students were enrolled?
Oh, it was just, it kind of goes like this. You have, let's say, your Saturday morning ladies group, which won't amount to anything but just enjoying themselves. And then I had a few part-time people, of which Carl Sampson was one, a very, a nice young man. He was about 14, I think, when he started.
Wow.
And he started with it for 5 years with me. And then when he became 18, he asked me what he should be doing as far as his furtherance of his career. And I gave my suggestion. You have two avenues. You could either work with LAC,
Mm-hmm.
Minneapolis, or Gamble, which I had at that point already come back from.
Oh, so you at that point you came back from studying with Gamel?
Yeah, because what happened was I had about a year and a half, and in 1976 was when I met Gamel.
Yeah. And that was in New York.
Well, what I did is I went to New York because I had a good friend who was a really fine painter, a couple of years older than me, Charles Fall.
Yeah.
And there's some books on him as well.
Sure.
Anyway, he invited me to New York because he had a really fine studio, a huge loft
Mm-hmm.
in Manhattan there. And as we met in Ohio, and at the same time you were talking to me about my school, I was making connections with galleries in Ohio,
Yeah.
the better ones. And so I met him there, and we got along, and he was a really fine painter. So he said that he was back and forth from New York. He said, why don't you come to New York and see if it's a fit for you? And also during that 1976 period, he had another studio that he was working out of.
Yeah.
And he said, "You're going to use my studio," and that's how that happened.
I see, sure. Okay, so okay, let's stick with New York for a second. So what was your initial reaction to the New York art scene?
Pretty exciting, actually, because as I mentioned to you, Chuck was there. There was another artist by the name of John Koch
Mm-hmm.
who had passed away. He was an older artist who I had the opportunity to meet. So I was meeting some of the people in the realist tradition who, how would I say it? They're really on the forefront of what you're receiving today. It was
Sure.
so early in the game that a lot of the stuff that we love and love today was almost scoffed at in the modernist uh, times, those
Mm-hmm.
early times during the
So
1970s. So, but what was exciting for me is the social scene. I saw how the galleries operated, how they courted clients and other patrons to corporations and so on. So it was a wonderful eye opener for me to learn the business of art, as well as to meet up with fellow artists who had the same ambition and a lot of drive.
sure.
So it was pretty exciting that 1970-ish type time because it's just on the cusp of having to explode.
Yeah. Yeah. Now those painters that you met in New York, were they coming out of the John Vanderpoel lineage?
Not John Vanderpool, John Koch.
Oh, so
K O
they were trained
K
by
O C
John
H.
Coe. Is that right?
Yeah,
And who
yeah,
was
Koch.
KLCH?
Koch.
KOCH. And who did he study with?
I'm not really sure. You'd have to probably look that one up.
Okay. That's
But he's
okay.
very prominent in New York, and really he did a lot of really fine interiors.
I see. Okay, great. So just to back up there for a second, Alan. So yeah, what you're saying is I've heard so much about that, like the early days, the 1970s of figuration. I mean, it was just so hard to find teachers that you could actually go to get a solid academic training. Um, and yeah, I just find that fascinating. Like it must be incredible now in your position to observe all these different schools that have opened up around the world, and just think, look at the opportunities that young people these days have that we never did.
Exactly. But it was at the same time, as I always laughingly think of it with Lack. He said, "You're a pioneer." I used to think to myself and tell my wife, I said, "I didn't want to be a pioneer. I want to learn this stuff and have a
Yeah,
little easy time of it."
sure, sure. And in New York at that time, if you were a figurative artist, was there like a sense of hostility amongst like the modernist school?
Well, this is the problem: is that the galleries would not really look at seriously um, realist artists. I mean, you almost had to have a connection or something like that to get in,
Yeah,
which I did do. I mean, I was pretty savvy as far as figuring out how to get around the obstacles that most people run into as artists.
sure,
And
sure.
I also, because of Chuck and a few other people, I was privy to going to parties because, as you know, New York is sort of a party town.
Yeah.
So that you would meet people on the streets who were in soap operas, budding actors and singers and all the
Mm,
rest.
mm.
It was kind of an interesting time, really.
Yeah,
Even though it was in some ways difficult, in other ways, like say with Bob Dylan or something, the singer,
yeah.
you were sort of on the beginning fringes of things. So as you said, it was interesting then to see what has happened today.
Yeah,
Yeah, opportunities are wonderful today for anyone who wants to do something representationally.
that's right. Yeah, yeah. Okay, Alan. So I guess from here we can talk about your first initial meeting with R.H. Ives Gammell.
Yes.
So how did that come about?
Well, when I was in New York in 1976, I was there with Chuck Paul. I was going to get set up with doing some work at his studio,
Hmm.
and I thought it was a pretty great opportunity just to kind of get acquainted with it and so forth. But what happened was when I was there, I thought to myself, because I hadn't met Gamble at that point, um, I might just give him a call and just see if he would consider seeing me,
Mm,
because New York to Boston is about 3 hour drive.
yeah.
Um, and because I was pretty footloose and free at that point, I called him and he actually answered the phone.
Wow.
And I was thrilled, you know.
Can imagine.
Um, and as we talked, I explained I was a student of Richard Lack, who he really had a lot of admiration for,
Yeah.
and a little bit about my background, and that I was in New York. And he said, "Well, why don't you come up and see me?" So I was thrilled, and that was on Memorial Weekend.
Yeah. That was
And so
incredible.
I just jumped. He told me it was I was there on a weekend, so it was on I think the Monday
Hmm.
that said to come on and see him, and then I met him at Fenway Studios.
That's right.
In Boston.
Yeah. Yeah. And was he? Did he have students with him when you went in there?
No, when I went there, I'll just tell you a little bit of the whole story. It's kind of cute.
Yeah. Sure.
I pulled up. Now, mind you, before I met him, I had dreams about the guy.
I can imagine.
Most,
Yeah.
mostly because I heard so much about him with Lack. I saw his work. I saw some of the students he worked with, like Richard Whitney, who I was very impressed with. He's a
Yeah.
very artistic. And so we always talked at Lack's place about Gamble. So
Hmm.
when I talked to him, and he had asked me to come over there or see him in Boston, I pulled up in the car, and as I was pulling up from across the street, he was getting out of the car from the gentleman who chauffeured him around.
Okay.
He had a gentleman who did that.
Yeah.
And so I looked across the street, and it was kind of like having a aura of light in the street. And so I'm looking, I'm saying, my God, that's the man himself, you know. And so he had me set up for a certain time. I think it's probably around 10 o'clock or so. And then so I went in there, nervously knocked on his door, and he said, "Come on in." And I had a nice portrait with me, a portrait of a young girl.
Hmm.
And I brought it with me, took it down. We had to go downstairs to the main part of the studio where these huge windows were.
Hmm.
And we sat down and talked. And he asked me about my background. I showed him a picture. And then after really a nice conversation, he said, "Well, I think, I would like to be able to work with you and show you a few things." And I can't remember the whole conversation, but it was just, I was in dreamland.
That
So
would be incredible.
I then called my wife and told her about the opportunity to study there.
Hmm.
She was shocked. She thought, "I thought you were going to study and work in New York." But anyway, I told Gamble I was going to pass up the opportunity,
Yeah.
that I would definitely be there. And so I arrived at his Williamstown studio, which is about 3 hours or so from, that would be west of Boston.
Hmm.
And that's where I studied for the next few months.
Sure. So now the Williamstown studio was where Gamma will take his students over the summers, right?
Correct.
Okay. So
And there were just four of us there at that particular time.
okay. So who was with you?
That would be Tom Dunley, another fine artist,
Hmm.
Jan Posvar,
Mm.
and David Lowry,
Okay.
and myself. And I think there was one other guy there, David Curtis, that in my notes, I remember talking to him, but at this point in my life, I didn't remember it.
Sure. Sure.
So I was glad I had those notes.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll
So
we'll get to talking
that,
about those in a minute.
okay.
Okay. So when whilst in Williamstown, did you actually live in like did Gamble have a studio? Was it part of his home, or how did you go about living there?
Yeah, he had a large compound. I think he had, can't remember how many acres, but he had quite a few acres. Absolutely gorgeous property.
Yeah.
He had his house and adjacent two studios with bedrooms and a kitchenette. But I stayed, as my predecessors that were students had a boarding house, which was not too far from there, where the elderly lady boarded out her rooms to the visiting artists.
I see.
And so that's where I was. And that was also kind of a fun thing because we were able to go into town easily from there. And also the Clark Institute of Art was there. So I was, as I
Yeah.
mentioned to you before, I'm a hound for going to museums and studying almost regularly.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. Okay. Great. So, Alan, can you tell me a little bit about the daily routine you had in Williamstown, starting with Gamma?
Well, I was treated kind of special, which I really appreciated from Gamble. He gave me the studio to use exclusively, one of the studios. He had two of them for artists. And so he had me actually working on portraits. It was not a beginning thing, so you understand. It was taking a student who had already been through the cast and all the rest of that stuff.
Sure.
And fine-tuning the portrait work and landscape, which is what the two areas I really wanted to absorb from Gamble.
Yeah.
And it was fantastic because not only did you get the teaching and the curriculum of day-to-day study, but I made it a point, because I was that kind of person, of knocking on his door practically daily and asking him a question. And sometimes it was a brief answer, and sometimes it took about almost 2 hours.
Wow.
And he would really go over the various artists and what their strengths were and their weaknesses, and just a lot of things that I have in my notebook, which will come out, hopefully in a few months.
Sure, sure. Okay, great. So, from what I understand, I mean, the way that actually Gamble had modeled his own curriculum, it's very much in line with the curriculum of the École des Beaux-Arts, because during summers, I believe that was when students were basically, when teachers were on holidays, they just went out and painted landscape over the summer. Is that correct?
That's correct. Now, the other thing that was interesting is I was also very adamant about doing landscapes.
Yeah.
What I did at the time, and which was both unique with Gamble and Lack, was they didn't believe in doing large landscapes.
No?
At that time. Yeah, it was just kind of I don't know, for whatever reason, but so when I presented to Gamble I was going to be working at this place or that place, there was interesting waterways and bridges and things like that I could paint. When I first started setting up, I had a canvas that was about 30 wide by, say, 24 tall.
Yeah.
Which for him was huge.
Yeah.
So he looked at me kind of strange and said, "So you're taking on quite a landscape there." At the time, I really didn't understand what the deal was, but they didn't like the idea of artists doing large landscapes, which I couldn't get in my head.
Sure.
So, but I insisted on it, and he let me do it, and actually Lack accepted that idea too, because I was pretty much a bull in a china shop. If I wanted to do something, I was going to do it.
Sure.
But I didn't want to push my luck with doing something they absolutely hated,
Yeah, yeah, sure. Okay, so what's really fascinating about this period, Alan, is that at the same time while you're studying in Williamstown with Gamble, you're also taking notes.
Yeah, virtually daily.
Virtually daily, okay. And so at that point, were the notes just for your own purpose, or did you have intention of, at that point, creating a book in the future?
No, I had no idea that that would even be. I did everything for myself, not trying to think about sales or anything else. It was basically so I could remember some of the things he told me, especially about other painters, influences, and one of the interesting things he told me when I would be talking about some painter, let's say John Sargent, he said the one thing you have to keep in mind, no matter who you work with or study with, is that you're going to pick up what they have of value to teach you, but you're also going to pick up their weaknesses.
That's
so
right.
He said, always have to be on guard to not to fall into the trap of picking up something that someone did that was a bit of a flaw, let's say, and then incorporate it into your own work, which would have made it sort of a pseudo copy of that artist, but lesser.
Yeah. Yeah, I see. And Gamble's, from my understanding, Gamble's opinion of painting was that it was a tremendously difficult art. Is that right?
Yeah, it's hard to explain that to most people because there are millions of people that can paint adequately well. But when you're talking about the 1% that do it extremely well, excuse me, that's very rare.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I remember reading about that actually, and how Gamble was saying that there aren't many painters born in every generation that are going to be, good painters, and fewer still that are going to be great ones.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So, in regards to your notes, so they're basically about Gamble's working methods, artists that he's mentioned, and things like that. Do you think that kind of information has become lost today?
Well, that's a tough answer there because I would say it's lost. There's a lot of people that are doing some good things today. There's a lot of talent out there, but other things work into that analysis, and that is, can they survive?
Yeah.
Can they make money at it and they're not discouraged?
Hmm.
Gamma, whenever someone brought him a young student, which they did when I was there, and asked if he would, I think he was probably a teenager, would be good enough to work with him, and he actually turned him down. And I was
Yeah.
like, felt a little sorry for the guy.
Yeah.
But if he persists, in a year or two and brings up his work, he said, I'll consider at that point of, what to do next.
Hmm.
But the reason he did that is to be fair to the person, not to think of this as an easy way to go.
Sure. Sure.
Even though Gamble was very wealthy, um, he also knew the difficulties of someone not only in learning the craft, which is tough in itself,
Mm.
but to survive. And then he also had this thing with females where he didn't really accept that easily because, in fact, not at all,
Wow.
because they often would study and maybe you would pour a lot of time and effort into developing their craft with them, and they wind up getting married, having kids, and whatever they do, and they forget about it for years or don't do it at
Sure.
all.
Yeah.
So, and that was a discouragement for him, mostly because he wanted to see people carry on the tradition, keep it as true as possible,
Hmm.
and never go backwards. I love that about Gamble. If you were working on a portrait, for example, as I did, and I can remember him coming into the studio, I was pretty good at characterizing a head. In fact, I was very fast at it.
Yeah.
But I neglected to work on the coat that the elderly man had uh, as much as I should have, And he had a open kind of jacket with a zipper to it. So
Hmm.
I would put it, and he would come in and say, he'd rub out the head with a pink coloring, and he said, work on that zipper. And he said, get the design of, get the beauty of it. And so he must have done that about 4 or 5 times.
Wow.
But the thing about it is that even to this day, with my wife Holly, if we're working on something and the sleeve is not up to what it could be, or if it changes and it's actually a better design when the girl sat, you stop everything and you address that. Now
Yeah.
that's the kind of caliber you want from any uh, artist or teacher, is
Hmm.
to not fall back on a kind of laziness.
Sure. Sure.
Or not taking your art as seriously as you should, like the old masters. I mean, they just poured their heart into it.
Yeah. 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 And that's great. Just learning about Gamel's standards and how he really wanted the best to only take up this art is just so heartening. And did you find that he would often turn students down, or perhaps say no, just to be able to kind of testing their eagerness to learn to see if they'll ask again? Because I heard that's something that he done on a few occasions.
You mean if I did that?
Well, but what I've heard is basically that some students that would want to study with Gamel, Gamel would actually turn them down in the beginning
Oh,
just to see if they had the eagerness to keep persevering to ask again.
oh, without a doubt.
Yeah, yeah. He just wanted the best, basically. He wanted the best to keep the tradition as pure as possible.
Well, you have to understand too. Gamble was very astute. He was an author. He was no nonsense, a very smart man, and he could read personalities. I mean, he could tell who was going to be serious, who wasn't.
Yeah,
In fact, some of the guys I knew who were kind of thrown out of the studio after I think a year or so. So, and I
wow.
won't mention names, but you had to take it seriously, and he could show you the full gamut of his personality, from very gentle to screaming at the top of his lungs.
Wow, yeah, I've heard that as well. And he didn't really like students leaving. I heard that he was quite protective of his students as well. Is that right?
Yeah, I can only speak from my point of view because I knew I was going to be there briefly. He did invite me back the following summer if I wanted to,
Hmm.
but the other aspect you have to understand with Gamble is he's extremely strong personality.
Yeah,
I mean, you were under his thumb, and you wanted to be. I mean, he just had this aura about him that you wanted to please him. Uh, Another example I could give you is when he came into the studio a few times with me. It was humorous because he'd always inject an English word we'd never heard of before. His vocabulary was incredible. So I would go to my notebook and I kind of scratched that one down and said, "What did he mean?" You know.
Mm.
So anyway, I'm trying to give you a picture of the man and the times a little bit because it was a person and a personality that if you were around him all the time, you were dominated. There's no question about it.
Yeah.
So in order to breathe, I could understand in some cases where someone would leave. In my case, I probably would have come back a second season, but I had gotten myself financially behind because of my study with him,
Yeah.
that I had to separate the portraits. The other thing I should tell you, too, at the same time, which is interesting, is Richard Lack was mounting these exhibitions, and he was counting on me as one of the artists to participate.
Mm-hmm.
So he wanted me to get through this Gamble project and get some pictures to him because we were showing at that time in Texas
Sure.
back shows. And you keep in mind also that this was just beginning to have the realist movement take shape, and that's where the book Realism and Revolution came in.
Yeah. 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 I've heard of
So
that.
all these things were happening between Lack, Gamble, my being in New York, trying to make some connections, meeting people, and then I had a family, so it's kind of like figuring out what's your priorities and how can you get these things accomplished.
Sure. Sure. So
So let me just back up a little bit.
yeah.
To
Sure.
talk about Gamble and the people leading or coming is that I knew from my perspective, if I was there another time, it would have been great, but probably more than that would have been almost too much.
Yeah. Yeah. Sure. So it was a very intensive environment.
Yeah, but it was also very exciting. I mean, everybody, if they went back to Boston during that time, I think he went back twice.
Yeah.
He had to check on things at his other studio and home, but they all wanted to jump in the car with him just to hear him talk all the way.
Incredible. That would have been such a privilege. Okay, so the year that you finished your training in Williamstown, was that 1978?
With Gamble?
With Gamble, yeah.
No, that was about 3 months.
Okay.
I worked on 3 portraits, 2 actually more serious portraits.
Mm-hmm.
We set up side size, and then in the afternoons I took off to do landscapes, which I showed him either that evening or the following day.
Yeah.
And that was my routine: the portraits and then the landscapes.
Okay, great. So after that period, did you move back to Newburgh, New York? Is that right?
Yeah. What happened was, let's see, I went back to Ohio because I decided not to make the move to New York at that point. But what I had happened to me was when I was in Ohio, I was showing also with this Chuck Paul.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened was another guy contacted me who said he'd heard about me, who was in Ohio. He's from New York, and he said, "Can I, come and see you and talk to you in the studio?" And I said, "Sure." So he said he's been there for a few months, and he couldn't handle it in Ohio. It was too, how would I say, it's not socially active like
Sure.
you would have in New York. So he said, "I'm going to go back to New York." He says, "If I find a place, would you consider moving over there?"
Mm-hmm.
I said, "Well, I really don't know where to go," or that kind of thing. He said, "Well, look, I'll make the inroads. I'll find a place. If you're interested, I'll set it up for you if you want to have me do that." And I said, "Well, I'll think about it." So what happened is he did.
Sure.
He really got involved because
Okay.
he wanted to study with me too. That's why I should tell you.
Oh, all
He
right.
wanted to spend time working with me. He was doing restoration of artwork. Really wanted to be an artist, but he was doing that for income.
Yeah.
And he said he'd already heard about me from somebody, I can't remember who.
Mm-hmm.
And so I found a place in Newburgh, which worked out really well.
Mm-hmm.
I was about an hour out of Manhattan, so
Okay, great.
I was there 3 years.
So you're in Newburgh, New York for 3 years, and
Yeah.
okay, sure, all right. But in 1982, you returned to Ohio. Is that right?
Yeah, right about there.
Okay, but you still maintained your connection to New York at that time.
Yeah, I met several collectors. One was Fred Ross, who now has
Wow.
the ARC site.
Yeah.
And he was at that time just beginning to collect paintings because he was becoming a very successful businessman.
Mm.
And we hit it off quite well. He was a very congenial guy,
Mm-hmm.
and we both had the love of Bouguereau's work
Yeah.
as well as the academics.
Sure.
And so when I moved back to Ohio, it was mostly just to kind of get my thoughts together because I really wanted to be in a warmer climate.
Yeah.
But I also had a gallery in Ohio, which I was selling them work, or I should say, giving them work to sell.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that was working out quite well because I would be able to sell work in New York and also in Ohio. And
Sure.
but I wanted to corner doing a better job at plein air work, which would necessitate me getting out of cold weather and only have a few months to work in to going to Florida, which, as you know, is kind of a little mini paradise.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so
Sure.
that's what I did about 1984.
In 1984. Okay. Right. So, at that time, you were, through your gallery, you were basically um, creating portraits and landscapes.
Yeah, I did a lot of what rose gardens. That's a whole
Yeah.
nother story there. But I was doing a lot of rose garden pictures and also portraits. And I got advice from some banker people there who took to me pretty well. And so I was able to do portraits, and the landscapes sold pretty well.
Yeah.
And then because of that, I met other people who, because they saw articles in newspapers about my sojourning, because when you come from New York to anywhere else, they like to know what's going on. So
Sure.
I get these articles in the newspapers, which is kind of a life of its own. And then so I began to get collectors who would want things about every other year, or have their child painted, or their grandchild. So I had sort of a recurring clients, which is extremely important for any artist.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, thanks for that, Alan. So, just moving on to, I think it was 1983. I read in your bio, you went on basically a grand tour to London. Is that right?
Oh yeah, you reminded me of all that.
Yeah. And you
Now,
studied the work of the naturalists during that period.
well, the thing was this, okay? I really wanted to know how to paint the landscape in my own way, and I knew that Bastien Lepage, who was one of my favorites,
Yeah.
pioneered what they call the square brush approach, okay?
Okay.
And I found that George Clausen and Latang and Stanhope Forbes
Mm-hmm.
were sort of disciples of Bastien Lepage.
Sure.
You know who Bastien Lepage is, I
Yeah.
assume.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So I just decided to make a trip, go there for a couple of weeks, and hunt down whatever I could on those artists. And
Mm-hmm.
as it turned out, I was able to scour the libraries and the galleries in London, and I actually met some more people, which was interesting too, and gallery dealers. And so it was just a really nice time, even though it was brief.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened was I was able to get the knowledge that I was looking for. Now, at the same time, there were these books coming out about the New England School.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I just bought a bunch of them. In fact, I've got almost a suitcase of books when I left London. And it was one guy that, the London people are so friendly and nice. I
Yeah.
had this enormously heavy baggage. And so this one guy comes alongside me. I was barely getting 2 bags. He said, "Can I help you?" So he took the heaviest one. I felt so sorry for him, but he was so great. So
Uh,
all those books I brought back to Ohio, and I was just scouring through their technique and all the rest. And so I started to establish practicing it. And at the same time, Black was having these shows in and around Minneapolis, and he was making inroads in Texas.
mm-hmm.
And so when we would get together, because I would be all over the place in the country, I shared with him the square brush approach that they were using in London, and it was pretty interesting to develop it. And he got excited about it. So all these things were happening kind of, all of us were, as I say, I was kind of that pioneer guy.
Yeah.
Didn't want to, that's what it wound up being.
Sure. Okay, Alan, I just want to back up for a second there. So the naturalist painters, can you explain to me the difference between realism and naturalism?
Well, to be honest with you, they're just terms. People try to, pigeonhole what you are and who you're following.
Mm.
Um, when American Artist had an article put out on me, which was 1983 or 4, the guy who was interviewing me said a lot of artists consider themselves either impressionists or realists or that kind of thing. He said, "What would you consider your work?" And so I had to think about that. I said, "Well, I'm a naturalist." He said, "Well, what's that?"
Mm-hmm.
So that's where that kind of term kind of got popularized, because I kind of, in my own mind, coined it. Now, I'm sure other people may have used it, but I was the only one I knew that used that particular term
Sure. Yeah.
for doing it in a contemporary way. So to pigeonhole people is a little hard, because I took the advice of Gamble, and you really have to be influenced by the few people who you admire the most.
Yeah.
And I'm talking about old masters. And then try not to get caught up in their weaknesses,
Yeah.
because it'll even worse in your own work. So it's really a balance when you're an artist, to find that groove, whether you call yourself an artist, or an impressionist, or a naturalist, or classical realist, or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
Lack coined that term to help describe what he was doing.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, sure. Okay, great. So one thing I want to clarify, Alan, is can you give me a summation of the square brush approach? What does that approach involve? Involve?
Actually, kind of like it's put up forth there. You're actually using paint in a way to put it down very flatly. You're putting it down rather boldly, and you're building sections onto that.
Yeah.
Now, the interesting thing is you don't really see that evidence in Bastian's work as much as you do in the English school,
Mm-hmm.
like Sir George Clausen, especially him. But they kind of just kept it that way. Now, what's interesting about what I'm telling you here is when you push that forward into the modernist mode, that's where you get this cubism and all this nonsense. It's almost childish, you know. But the point of the square brush, flat brush, is it goes actually back to Rayburn. So, the early artists, you can see it in their work, but unless somebody explains to you that it's a manipulation of a certain type of brush in a certain way, it's a little bit mystifying.
Sure.
Because when you look at the work, it just looks great. But when you peel back how it was done, that's where this whole thing comes into play.
Okay.
As to what square brush is.
So was it a wet on wet approach?
Yeah, I would say largely that's what it would be.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. So upon your return from London, you went to Florida, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, and you moved there, you mentioned, because it was a warmer climate and it was more suitable for year-round plein air painting.
Exactly. And I got real busy doing that as soon as I got to Florida.
Yeah.
I was actually, in fact, what's helped me all along the way was, oddly enough, newspaper articles. People would see me painting or something, wherever I was, and somebody would approach me and say, "I'm a journalist, and I see you're painting out here, and et cetera. And can we do an article? Because it's kind of unique when you see out in the middle of nowhere somebody doing painting."
Mm.
And Florida was pretty much out in nowhere. I mean, you get palm trees and things, but culture you usually think of as New York or Boston.
Sure.
But anyway, they were working, and in this one instance, I had these kids come around and watch me, and a brother and a sister were rather smart, and they had the kind of inquisition that the conversation lent toward painting and all that, and that I guess their mother was from New Jersey, so they were a little bit cultured.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, "Would you be interested in posing for some pictures?" And they said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, you have to ask your parents." And so they came out and met me, and we hit it off, and I used them for years. So
wow.
I was able to get off into the plein air world in Florida rather quickly.
Sure.
And then as you meet the parents and other people, and you're showing in the galleries and different things, it kind of picks up steam.
Yeah, yeah. And you were pretty successful at that time in selling your plein air paintings?
Yeah, well, see, you got to keep in mind the context I made in New York, the context I made in Ohio. Ohio is a very cultured area, even though I don't know how many other people would know it. To me, it would be like San Francisco or Chicago because the people bought pictures, they appreciated it, and I really enjoyed living in Ohio. I just didn't care for the cold weather.
Yeah.
Um, so, it all plays together. There was a
Sure.
lot of things happening at once.
Okay. Right.
So, in order to answer your question about, I try to maintain the context I always made because I try to make the best ones.
Yeah.
And mind you, I also communicate with Gamble. A couple of weeks before he actually passed away, I took Fred Ross, the businessman and friend who was from New Jersey, and he and I kept contact during those years. And I said, would you care to want to meet Gamble? I said, tell him what we've been doing business-wise and artistically to try to improve the academic, what would you call it, promotion.
Mm-hmm.
And so I called Gamble, and he said, yeah, I'd love to see you. And so we flew up there, and he had a talk with me and Fred, and he was very excited because all his lifelong work was beginning to pay off through his students.
That's right. Yeah.
And so Fred gets back home, and I returned back to my place, and Fred actually got a letter a couple of weeks after Gamble passed.
I think I've seen that letter on the ARC website.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing, really.
Yeah. Yeah. That's incredible. And yeah, what a thing for Gamble to experience towards the end of his life, that all his hard work had actually paid off in the end through his students.
I have to tell you, to me, Gamble was such a towering force that was so against the grain of modernism that, and all the, what would you call it, buffeting that a person would get during that era.
Mm-hmm.
It's incredible that he just hung in there, taught a few students at a time, didn't care what they thought or said, and just kept at it. And to me, I just marvel at it.
Yeah, it was a real tenacious character, it sounds like. Okay, so Allan, let's move on to your time after this period. So after this, you went traveling, and to my understanding from your biography, you met Russian painters at some period.
Yeah, let me see. That was around 1990, I think, or something like that.
Okay, how did that come about?
Well, actually, there was a Russian painter. I guess he was in Canada, and he was very good. And he knew Carl Sampson, who at this time was doing his own, work and doing a really fine job as a portrait artist in Ohio. And because Carl and I always kept in touch, he said, I've got this fellow who would like to take a few artists to Russia and meet Russian counterparts and do some painting together. And so he said, would you be interested? And I said, sure. So that's how that all came together. And they got all the itinerary figured out. We went to Moscow. We went to St. Petersburg. We're there 6 weeks. And also to a little town called Kolomna, which no Westerner was permitted to go.
Wow.
So it was an interesting time there, too, for us, because that was just the beginning of the collapse of the Soviet Union into capitalism.
Yeah.
So you had these two different mindsets. The younger ones wanted the freedom. The old ones were used to everything, everybody looking over everybody's shoulder and tattling,
And
so that's a whole story I would love to write about at some point, too.
Sure, I can imagine. And so at that point, what was your initial thoughts on the Russian academic approach that those Russian artists were using?
I think that they actually came closer to the, I guess the Newland School, but the Bashnapaj ideal because they never went into modernism. But the problem was the talent there, even though the landscape painting was really good, I thought, exceptional, the painters that we worked with. But the figure work was, to me anyway, a little weaker than the previous generation. So, but we had a great time, and we shared a lot of just getting acquainted from two different worlds.
Sure. And they were basically I'm assuming they were trained at the Russian Academy.
Yeah, and also in St. Petersburg. I think that's where the Russian artists that brought us up there had studied, and the classrooms were fabulous. I mean, they were just gorgeous.
Did you actually have a tour of the Russian Academy? Did you?
Yeah, we did.
Oh,
We went.
fantastic.
Yeah, we went through all the anatomy class. I don't know where the students were. I can't remember if there was off time or. But anyway, we had access to all the school and the museums there, the Russian museums. I can't remember the Tetrakhov. It could have been in Moscow. It's a little bit of a blur to me right now. But
Yeah.
we had such a good time, and they were toting us around, and we kind of felt like we were just having a good time, laughing and carrying on. And they would say, "Okay, we're here." So we broke out the brushes and went into the countryside. All of us kind of grouped out, fanned out,
Hmm.
and did our pictures. And then they had a little exhibition for us. It was kind of nice.
Wow, what a great experience to be able to actually see the other side of the realist tradition, I suppose, in Russia at that time.
Yeah, it was fabulous.
Yeah, I can imagine. Okay, so let's move on. So in 1993, you opened a school for plein air painting in Florida. Is that right?
Uh, no, that was a little bit later. I think that was around 19. I moved around a couple times in Florida. Let me see. I'm trying to think of the date of that. Somewhere around 1991 or two, I moved to an area called Safety Harbor.
Hmm.
And that's when I decided to formally go ahead and take in some students. And I didn't know how it would work out, but that's where I started the school. And I mentioned it to Lack as well, and he was real excited about it. He actually came down to visit too.
Oh, great.
Yeah, so just so you know, even though I was doing things further away from most people, I was very much in contact with everybody.
Yeah, sure. No,
So
that's
I
great.
started school for a few years. What I didn't care for was the younger people I had on Saturdays because
Yeah,
I was still a practicing painter, so I didn't want to do a whole full-time thing. But I did do a full-time for a couple of years, but it was kind of miserable because I only had one person who was up to par,
yeah,
and it was taking away from my portrait trade and other work. And I just decided after a period of time, it wasn't worth my time.
yeah,
Um, and so when it comes to teaching, you're really spending so much time with people. To me, it was like babysitting, quite honestly.
yeah.
So that the younger ones actually got me more enthused, like around 12, 13, 14, that were still going to school, and they would come there on a Saturday, and the interaction was good, and they were more receptive. The older ones, and I had some much older students, um, they were there just to have a good time and talk and pass the day, and I would go to each one. They literally just didn't quite get it. So
Sure, sure. Yeah, and it must be frustrating for you as well. Okay,
yeah, that's
so
why that's why I let it go.
yeah, and well, on your biography, it was saying due to increasing commissions, you decided to close your school.
Yeah, what happened during that time is that portrait art was really taking off, and because of the article that was on me, an American artist, I was contacted by some of the portrait groups. Would you consider us representing you with our uh, business? And I said, that'd be fine. So as a result of that article, I got a rash of commissions.
Yeah,
And the school was actually interfering with a lot of that because I was beginning to travel extensively
yeah,
in different areas of the country. So that's the other reason that I had to shut it down.
sure. Okay, and
Because I have to also explain, I was making very good money in portraiture, where teaching really is kind of a lackluster thing.
mm, mm. Did you feel at that point an obligation to pass on what you had learned to future generations?
Well, that's another good point because there are some people who are suited for teaching, and some are better maybe by example or as Lax being a pioneer
Mm,
or some other aspect to the whole gamut of what we call art.
hmm.
I'm really not a good teacher per se. I more or less would be better at a critique kind of situation, which I've done even up till recently, um, where if somebody would show me some work, I could give them a few tips, and if that works for them, that's great. But as far as long-term teaching, there are other people who could do a good job for them that, uh, I would suggest they do.
Sure, sure. Okay. So from that period, Alan, to our current day now, was there anything in particular that happened that was really important to your career that we should mention?
Oh, to this day, well, you got me thinking on that one. Well, I did make another trip to London,
Okay.
and uh, that was with we met with another artist. That was Steve Levine, who was another
Okay.
very fine.
Yeah, Stephen J. Levine, is that right? Or Levine?
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So we met up with him there. And yeah, well, the other thing up till now, just to answer your question, is it's been travel.
Yeah,
It's only been the last, let's see, probably the last couple of years where I've just chosen to um, do what I do, and um, I wanted to do more ambitious, like salon type pictures, to answer your question.
yeah.
So I'm doing very ambitious pictures, theme pictures, and I also, as I mentioned, have been working for certain patrons that have hired me over the last few years,
Okay.
paying astronomical fees, which I really appreciate.
Sure, sure.
So, that's taken up most of my time recently.
So at current, you're painting full time.
Oh yeah, I always paid full time.
Fantastic. Good, good, good to hear. Okay. Um, let's see. So I suppose that brings us up to date now. So instead of sort of focusing so much on your history, I can start to pose questions to you about the current resurgence of representational art. How's that sound?
Fine.
Yeah. Okay. So according to my research, you're one of the best plein air painters that are alive today. Many consider you.
Okay. Just so you know, I didn't say that. Okay, that's what
Okay.
Richard Lack. Richard Lack was kind enough to a journalist contacted him because they were doing a big article on me from Tampa newspaper
Sure.
because I had been involved with the cultural center there, and so they were writing about my school, about me at that time.
Yeah.
So they asked me, well, who have you studied with? So what I didn't know is they contacted the people that I'd mentioned to them, and the journalist did. And I thought it would just be a little tiny little thing in a paper, and that would be about it. So he said that what you just quoted to them.
Okay.
So I was kind of shocked, but pleased, and but there are a lot of fine plein air painters today.
There are. There are. That's right. Okay. So from my observations, there is a real resurgence of plein air painting happening in the United States at the moment. What's your opinion of the kind of quality of work that's being produced in the plein air art scene at the moment?
Well, to take it in the overall look, it started with portraiture because you have to make a living at this stuff.
Yeah.
And that was about a 19, say, 86, 87. Somewhere in the 1980s, I would say that explosion really began to take off.
Yeah.
In this country, we had, there's about 3 or 4 different portrait art organizations.
Yeah.
They also asked me to be a part of those in the, what would you call it, guiding committee or whatever it is.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
at that
Okay.
point, portraiture took off. Okay. So as a result of being able to do portraits and realism was coming back, you then had people doing plein air work, and that started to get caught on with different people, and it fanned out into different parts of the country. And as other artists and talents were coming up that were younger than me, it started to become a in thing to do, paint the town and that type of thing.
Yeah.
So it really took off, and I think there's some really fine landscape painters today.
Sure, yeah, I agree. But I also think, just from my observations, the plein air scene at the moment has taken on this kind of like hobbyist side. Would you agree?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes.
It seems a lot of people are just hobbyist painting for pastime and things like that with a Bashard box, And a lot of these conventions that have come around kind of promote that everybody should now get involved in this kind of appreciation and new reverence in nature.
Well, I'll say one thing about it as far as part timers because you need them, and I'll tell you why.
Yep.
Because uh, when you have someone, let's say, who is well to do and they want to open up a gallery, so they take a few classes of plein air painting, they can see how difficult it is to be a good painter.
Yeah.
And then when they open up a gallery, they'll know who's good and who isn't. Because you would be shocked, and I hate to even say it like this over this way, but
Mm-hmm.
the dealers who know next to nothing about what a good painting is. Anything before 1940, for example, you can just about see that the training was so well done earlier than that,
Yeah.
that there's just a host of really fine painters around. And in fact, even illustrators.
Yeah.
But so to answer your question about the plein air, all these things are an offshoot of something else. And as it happens, I don't mind the part timers, even though that maybe the quality is so, because you're going to have people who are ultimately going to either own a business or maybe they will open up a gallery, which they have in some cases, and they'll be able to help the really good painters get into the market.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So from that point of view, I look at it from two different angles: the business aspect of it, so you can survive, and the quality aspect, so that you can continue to do a good job. And so you have to have the money, the fuel to be able to continue.
Sure.
Because, as you know, there's a lot of sad cases, and I know some here in the States, where there's some awfully talented people who, they're married. In one case, I'm thinking about a married couple,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely dynamite painters, but
Yeah.
they're just struggling. They are just struggling,
Yeah.
and it breaks your heart.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, it's one of these things where it would have been nice, like in France, that the government stepped up and said, we're going to do a Salon d'America or Salon de France
Yeah.
or whatever you might want to call it, where they can help support some of these people who are having a little bit of a rough time, at least get them over a few years.
Sure. Sure.
So, to answer your question, all this stuff feeds into a bigger picture
Yeah.
where at one point I would have, as you suggested, they're sort of dismissed the part-timers. Maybe the quality is kind of shabby here and there.
Mm.
But on the other hand, when I was in New York for quite a while, and I saw that the dealers know next to nothing about
Yeah.
what it takes to do a picture, that I would suggest that they get into some painting classes where they actually have to paint a still life or have to paint a landscape.
Yeah.
It would open up the quality, and then you get even more collectors.
Yeah.
And that leads to another thing here I want to just mention, and that is when I was coming up the ranks, people would wonder where's the good quality art that they could purchase. And some of them were so turned off with modernism that even though they were very well off, and I dealt with a lot of people who were very, up in their corporations, CEOs and so forth. And they were just totally turned off. They said, I have no interest in collecting art because it's just junk.
Hmm.
So that was kind of part of the thing that, you have to kind of look at as well.
Sure. Yeah. That's really good. Thanks for explaining that, Alan. I think a lot of current contemporary realists are facing that decision now. Like, how can we promote this kind of work? And I think a lot of the argument is about informing these people about the actual working processes, writers and critics and such, about how this work is actually created. Because they don't really have that understanding. They don't really know what to do with this kind of work that's being created, this realist work. But just to back up for one moment before I go on with more current questions, I wanted to ask something which I think was really important in your bio. You were president of the American Society of Classical Realism, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, so for how long?
Well, about 7 years.
7 years.
Yeah, and they asked me to do it. In fact, they almost insisted I do it because I was running around and making connections. And, I knew people in New York, for example, and, thought that might be a good fix or a good mix, I should say. But as it happened, I got several thoughts running through my mind on that one.
Mm-hmm.
But I probably wasn't the best one to do that at that time because I was wrapped up in what I was doing.
Yeah.
It was hard for me to figure out how to help a whole group of people.
Sure.
But it was in good hands with Richard Lack, and they had another fellow there who was doing the magazine.
Yeah.
So that was another situation where it was time that was for me just adding on to what I already had on my plate.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I enjoyed, the fact that, they thought I could do some good. I don't know how much good that did for them, but it was in good hands no matter what, because the painters in Minneapolis were doing a good job. They were having shows, and there were just a lot of little things happening at the same time. Fred Ross was starting his ARC, show. So everybody, see, the thing is, when you're doing your own work and then you're trying to do something else, maybe that you're a little ill-suited for, it's just going to be a little tough to make that work.
Yeah.
So I told you before, I don't feel I'm a teacher, although I would love to help somebody. There are some people who are excellent at teaching. Maybe that's their forte.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I was president for 7 years, and then I think Steve Jerson took over shortly after that, and then they disbanded it.
Yeah.
But there are other factors there that I don't want to get into that were just a little bit cumbersome for trying to make the whole thing as a group grow.
Sure.
The other thing I'll mention too, which is a little bit of an insight there, is when they were having shows and you allow certain people into a group. Let's say you got a group of 12 really fine artists, and you put on some shows, and then they want to bring in some other artists. What happens is, if you're granted, let's say, lifetime enrollment, and so you can stay a show, what happens that's a little tragic is that the artists get lazy, and the work starts to go down. And so that was another part of the discouragement of this classical realism thing, was that the artists were good and very talented and well trained.
Yeah.
But for whatever reason, maybe the finances of these people were not as good as they could have been, or they had families, or whatever the situation may have been. The work shows when it suffered.
Yeah.
And so there was just a lot of little small things that were entering the picture that I couldn't figure out how to help. So to be honest with you, and I'm just trying to be very honest and frank, those play into the whole.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. That makes sense. And so, to my understanding, the American Society of Classical Realism ceased in 2005. Is that right?
Probably somewhere in there.
Yeah, sure, okay. I think, like you mentioned ARC before, and I know there are a few other organizations that have been established since the time of the American Society of Classical Realism. But let me pose you this question. Would you and your colleagues like to see the American Society of Classical Realism revived in our current day?
I would like to see the standards revived. I think if you could get the artists to get along, number one, they're like gathering squirrels. But if you could get a few people to pull together so the standards are high and that their feelings aren't hurt if something's rejected or whatever, you're dealing with a lot of artistic emotions, as you know.
Yeah.
As artists are very sensitive. Some are very shy. Some are outspoken.
Yeah.
And so you get into a situation where you're dealing with personalities where does that affect the quality going down the road?
Yeah.
So if you're aware of what's going on or what went on in the Academy Julian, that same thing happened because many people couldn't get into the École de Beaux-Arts, as you know. It's a very, very select group. Women were basically not allowed.
Yeah.
And then other artists started forming ateliers, and then what happened? You have Academy Julian, who let everybody in. And as Gamble wrote in his autobiography, the heyday was around the 1880s. After that, it started to go down.
Yeah.
quality. And
Yeah.
so by the time Gamble got there, even though he was excited and that everything was rather fresh and new for him, he really wanted to work with painters of that earlier period, which he was obviously a much later generation.
Yeah.
But that often happens. In my own thinking in the book is what I put down there is too much of a good thing is what collapsed the whole art world. When you
Wow.
have so much good going on and it's everywhere, it's overwhelming. So
Yeah.
where you go down?
That's
It's
right.
unfortunate, but things go in cycles, and those things happen. But I do think, to answer your question, that something good can come, and a revival is happening, whether we want it to or not. I think it's happening.
I
So,
agree.
yeah, if you get the right key people who are at heart generous people, that really care about the standards being high and that you don't step on somebody's toes that they're hurt, it can happen.
Great. That's a really good answer, Alan. Thanks for that. Um, okay, so we'll move back over to the more current questions. What I wanted to ask is I wanted to get your opinion on this. Why do you think Gamel has been left out of the history of 20th century art?
That's not going to happen for long. Well, the 20th century is not for art; it's for rock and roll. That's
Yeah,
why I look at it. I
sure.
mean, basically, it's for music, electric guitar.
Yeah,
I think music generally took off, but I think the arts, especially and literature, all the rest of it from the 19th century, just went into the dumpster.
yeah,
And Gamble also faults World War One and World War Two for decimating the fortunes of so many that were lost, or killed, or they were taxed out of their income or out of their wealth.
yeah,
So there's a lot of variables that fall into that. So to me, the 20th century, you could just basically write it off as, it's a non-event as far as the arts go, the painting arts and sculpture. But I do think it's on the upswing, and the thirst for quality again is what's going to drive it.
sure, sure. Yeah. Um, so,
Because think about it. When I'll give you a good example.
okay.
When I was coming up the ranks and they started to have these realist shows at the museums, I have to give credit to one historian that I met in Minneapolis. And in Cleveland, they had this massive show of academic arts, which included Dagnan Bouverie and Bache-Lepage and so many of them. And it was just absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah,
I can remember turning into one of the galleries, and I saw the Bache-Lepage Joan of Arc for the first time,
yeah.
and I absolutely was floored. And not only was I floored, but the people in the gallery were just, with their mouth was hanging open because I hadn't seen it before.
Yeah,
And so, to answer your question about could it happen again, I think if the quality gets to that level or close to it, you're going to see more excitement, more patrons, and all the rest of it begin to build up again. But hopefully, and I hate to think of it that way, but I hate to see it as a good thing that will last for a while, and then it's too much of a good thing,
sure, sure. So, in your opinion, Alan, do you think we've reached that level
You mean of quality?
of quality? Yeah,
Um, it's a toughie. Let's put it this way: I see the talent there. I think some of the basic training, um, in my opinion, is absent.
yeah,
Where the fundamentals to really do the picture well is still got to be brought up to grade. So I don't want to say anything other than the fact that there's a lot of great talent out there,
sure.
and I think that they want also to pick up the skill level. So we'll have to see what happens.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, essentially, do you think we're on the right track?
Yeah, I think the fact that somebody can actually paint a still life at 12, 13 years old or 18, and they're able to do something reasonably well. If they study nature, if they buckle down and do cast work, understand perspective, understand anatomy, know where they fit into the picture or the realm of their own personality. There's a lot to think about when you're talking about really, really caliber stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So a lot plays into it. It's kind of that thing we talked about earlier about the one percenters.
Yeah. Yeah. Sure.
There may be some who, like say John Sargent, who really didn't change much from Carlos Duran's work,
Yeah.
but he did it better.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Alan. So, what I want to ask, the next question I want to ask is, what do you think are some of the challenges that young artists are faced with today?
Uh, Probably all of that we've discussed
Yeah.
already. I
Yeah.
think you're talking about financially being able to hang in there. Hopefully, you have parents that are encouraging.
Yeah.
That's another obstacle that you're going to face with people who don't have the means. Is they're going to be worried about their child, how they're going to make it. The
Hmm.
other thing I should mention to you too, that's an important consideration, is everybody falls out of favor at some point.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how good you are. I don't care if you're a sergeant. I don't care if you're, Bugaro or whoever it is. After so much work of a certain personality, there is a tendency that it kind of falls out of favor.
Sure.
So for the artist, for my recommendation is make sure that you're financially secure. Don't try to get into too much debt,
Hmm.
and try to just maintain your lifestyle, and stick to your guns. Like my example would be gamble or even lack.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and you know, uh, do your best that way.
Sure. Sure. No, that's good advice. Thanks, Alan. Okay. So, in regards to your book, so when we were emailing, you mentioned that you're nearly finished.
Yeah, we're just fine tuning and working with Darren, and he is helping me clean up my own lingo.
Yeah.
And because I did it for myself, to remember what he said, but my wife, when she read it, the notebook, which I kind of lost for a number of years,
Hmm.
and because it was boxed up. And so as I looked at it, she said, I think I found it. And I looked through it. And I thought, it sounds kind of interesting. And she said, are you kidding me? She said, it sounds like you're actually there with Gamble, like
Yeah.
I'm with you. So I said, do you think it's worth putting out there? And she said, well, I do. See, she actually insisted on it. So I said, okay. So I started getting into it. And she would ask me questions like you are. Well, what does this mean? What does that mean? So I
Yeah.
had to think, well, okay, so I had to clarify this, clarify that. And then I'm not a book writer and editor, so I had to reach out to Darren, who does a great job,
Yeah.
and say, could you kind of help me get this formatted so it makes sense for people?
Sure.
And so we're doing that now. We're not too far from it, but I'm not in a rush in the sense that I don't want it to look chintzy.
Sure.
And I wanted to give plenty of so I wanted to show as much of Gamble's work that was other than what you're already been published.
Sure.
And so, if I can be in the forefront of opening up an explosion into Gamble's life, that would be a fantastic thing. Because as you mentioned earlier, why he's been ignored. Well, I think he knew he was a key person and that he just stuck to his goals. And I think we all have to.
Yeah.
You in Australia, in Australia, you got some fantastic painters of the 19th century.
Yeah.
Tom Roberts and so many of them.
That's right. Yeah.
I don't know where they were, or as far as actual locations,
Hmm.
but wow, they did some wonderful work.
Oh, they did. We've got amazing museums here that showcase their work. It's really, really great, fine quality work. Um, okay, so is Velatura Press, Darren's publishing company, going to publish your book?
Um, I was thinking about going with another publisher. I don't want to mention it here because it may change,
Sure,
but
sure.
he may or may not. But he's definitely involved with helping me.
Yeah, great. Is the book going to be made available to like a wide variety of bookstores?
Yes, yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic, great,
It'll
and
be worldwide.
yeah, so people could purchase it online and such.
Yeah.
Fantastic, really, really good. I'm looking forward for the release of your book. I definitely will be purchasing a copy, so I look forward to that. So just speaking of books as well, Alan, did Gamble, in your experiences, did Gamble and Lack ever recommend specific books or recommended reading to you?
Well, if you look at Gamble's Twilight of Painting,
Mm-hmm.
and then he Shop Talk of Edgar Degas and
Mm-hmm.
Dennis Miller Bunker and so forth, you kind of get a feeling for him.
Yeah.
Those people he really admired and in some cases worked with. Um, recommended reading. Well, I would say two of them right offhand would be Harold Speed
Yeah. Of course. Yeah.
and also Solomon J. Solomon, which actually helped me the most.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then you've got, let's see, I'm trying to think of, I can't think of books per se. I mean, Henry Poor on
Henry
composition.
Poor.
Henry Poor.
P-O-U-R.
No, Poore.
Okay. Never heard of him
And
before.
I had a whole list of them, but offhand I can't think of too many of them. Just those few right now.
Okay. That's fine.
I do a lot of digging of the old books and catalogs,
Yeah.
but some of their wording almost sounds strange to us today.
It does. Yeah. That's one of the problems with the old art instructional books, is the language has become quite outdated.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, Alan, from what I can see, just looking at your gallery, some of your images of your work on your online gallery and such, it looks like you are today implementing the square brush approach. Is that right?
Yeah, I use that quite a bit.
Yeah. So you're painting a lot of figurative paintings outside and plein air. So take me through your basic approach. How do you go about a day's work?
Well, I have to split it up a little bit because you're talking about when I get commissions, I have to set aside personal work from doing commissions.
Okay.
So they're done a little bit differently.
Sure.
So basically, what you want to do is, from my end of it, let's say I'm doing a figure composition. You come up with a thematic thought or idea as to what you want to do.
Mm-hmm.
And in my case, if I find somebody rather unusual or striking, and I especially like that 10, 12-year-old, age group,
Yeah.
then I'll ask them if they're interested in doing some posing and so forth. And I may just do a straightforward sketch. Many of those I have never shown, but or a drawing. And then from there, sometimes what will happen is I'll take the sketch or image that I've done, or a few of them, and I'll think about a picture that I can do around that.
Sure.
If you're familiar with Henry Regnault, in fact, even Page,
Yeah.
they started with a portrait or a particular part of their picture. To give you an example, and that's pretty much the way I work, that's why I'm mentioning it.
Mm-hmm.
Vashon of Page, the Joan of Arc that he did was actually just Joan of Arc. It wasn't those angels in there.
Okay.
And the canvas was cut just about in half. And
Wow.
he didn't add the other part of the angels until much later, and he sewed on the canvas.
Is that a matter of fact?
Yeah, and then the same thing, what else was I just thinking about? Henry Regnault,
Mm-hmm.
that did Salome. Are you familiar with him?
What's the painting called, sorry?
Salome.
Salome. I can't recall it.
It's in New York. It's a fabulous picture of a single woman with a knife or sword on her lap and
Okay.
with large dish. Anyway, it's a great painting. Henry Regnault was a big influence in France. He started off with just doing a portrait head, and then he also sewed on the rest of it.
Wow.
And it's magnificent. Yeah.
So it's a kind of piecemeal fashion.
And let me take you back even further. Peter Paul Rubens.
Yeah.
They found he would work even on wood and then would expand the canvases out.
Wow.
So there's kind of like, there are some artists who are, let's say, piecemeal artists, some that need to have the whole thing figured out. My feeling is whatever kind of situation you're looking for, you can sketch out the whole idea and then fit the models to that. Or you can take a model, let's say you've got a very appealing pose, a head looking a certain way, and you go, I'd like to make that a larger. What kind of theme can I add to that? So that's basically how I work. Okay. And then you may do some little landscape study for it. And I like to work from the idea first instead of from the model first. And then I could say, my grandkids, for example, I want you to lay in the grass and I want you to have this pose or that pose. And, they'll do it. And then that fits into composition.
Sure, sure. Okay. So you're painting Premier Q directly?
Uh, yeah, but I often do the thing that I think Harold Speed talks about as far as working with opposite colors.
Okay,
I
yeah.
may, for example, block in the head with sort of a green.
Hmm.
When I talk about saying green, I'm talking about like a tonal study with an opposite color and then overlay with your pinks and all that, which gives a actually third beautiful tones.
Sure.
Um, Sometimes I'll work very direct if I'm working too fast and just put on the color locally, scrape it down, let it dry, and then take it up again.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. So in regards to brushes and mediums, do you use a variety of brushes, or do you just stick with one kind of brush?
Yeah, a variety, but I pretty much stick to the brights.
The brights, yeah. Yeah.
The square brush.
Well, yeah, it makes sense if it's a square brush approach, you would stick with the bright. Sure. Uh,
Well, I just got used to it, and some artists only use rounds, and some use whatever maybe a mixture.
yeah, yeah. It's really open for preference, isn't it? The brush choice. You see people using rounds and filberts, or just browns, like you were saying.
Hmm
So, okay.
I've
So,
got them all.
sorry, what was that?
I said I've got all the brushes, but I just tend to use those mostly.
Yeah, you tend to stick with one. Yeah, sure. So, in regards to medium, what do you use?
Basically, if sometimes I'll use a pale drying oil,
Yeah.
and maybe I'll have a little varnish with it. That's when working quickly. Um, Other times, what I look to do for finishing is use nut oil,
Okay.
and
Sure.
that's basically it.
Do you varnish your paintings?
Yes, I do in between coats,
Okay. All right. Good.
just like lightly.
Very lightly. Okay. Do you ever take a painting from working out en plein air back into your studio?
Oh yeah,
Finish
all
it.
the time.
Yeah. So you finish it in the studio.
Yeah, because even in the instance of Monet, I mean, you use glazes, you use washes over the picture. You do whatever it takes to make the picture come to what it is that was you were interested in
Yeah.
with the landscape, if it's a sunset or whatever. And painting directly is fine, but sometimes it doesn't accomplish what you want.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. That's right. Okay. Great. So thanks for explaining your technique, Alan. I appreciate that. Uh, what I wanted to ask, another question was in regards to the Bug and Jerome drawing course, the plates, the lithographic plates. Considering that it wasn't part of your training, do you think it's a necessary part of a student's training as a first step, drawing from the flat?
I think it's very important. I think that's the whole thing that we mentioned earlier that's lacking in the work today.
Yeah,
I think if they understood that, they'd be well on their way.
sure, sure. Did you add it?
Because,
Go on.
well, I was just going to say that uh, all those things that are accessible today, especially that course,
Yeah,
you need to take advantage of. But along with that, you need to understand perspective. You need to understand gesture, movement.
yeah.
There's such a range of things. That's what when you're talking about painting and really doing a good job. There's
Hmm.
so much to it.
Sure.
It's but some of that stuff I cover in my book too a little bit, where there are examples of the past which I always like to use
Yeah.
of it just doing things in a certain way that seem odd to us today. For example, Bach Lepage is known to have worked on the Joan of Arc head probably, I don't know how many times, but it was just a lot of times.
Yeah.
And then he rub it out with black and
Wow.
repaint it. The
Incredible.
other thing that comes about, which is interesting, is uh, as in the Academy Julian, when they look for the ideal model, it's almost impossible to find that.
Hmm.
It's close to finding it. So what they would do is they use a composite of a couple
Okay.
or maybe three. So there's a lot to know about when you're talking about painting and your practice of a day-to-day basis is figuring in all those little things that make it a better picture
Hmm.
than just copying nature or copying a landscape. You really want to get into it and use your full potential is what I'm getting at.
Okay, sure. So just to go back to that composite approach that you were mentioning, use at the Academy Julienne. So I'm guessing that basically involves using an arm of one model and then a torso of another model, and perhaps the legs of another model. Is that right?
Well, the thing is this. Let's say you have somebody that's got a great body, but the arms are a little short.
Yeah,
I'm just using that as a silly example.
sure.
And in a painting, it may not come off except just like that.
Yeah,
So it may be necessary to have a stand-in model who has beautiful arms, and the rest of hers is okay too, but it has what you want. Now, I'll give you an example of an old master, Van Dyck.
yeah,
Now, he had a certain woman, I guess, who he used her hands for everything.
yeah,
So he would do the portraits, and I think he even had an assistant to do clothing,
yeah.
but the hands were by a special female that he used frequently.
Sure.
So I'm just trying to give you examples that the whole procedure is pretty much wide open
Yeah.
as far as your technical skills as they go along in the picture.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. That's great advice, Alan. So getting towards the end of my questions, I wanted to ask, in regards to the contemporary teaching studios that have been established today, do you have any affiliation with any of them?
Not really. I think as you get moving on, you have the newer crop, and as Gamble used to say, at some point when you're having a conversation, there's a point at which you have a meeting of the minds.
Yeah.
And so as you ask me questions and we get acquainted, as in any conversation, it's almost meaningless until you come to a certain point where you're really communicating. The minds really are communicating.
Sure.
And
Sure.
so that's an important feature as you're talking about socially. So to answer your question, I'm loosely affiliated with some of them, but to be quite honest, I like my independence away from that whole thing.
Yeah.
Um, Not to be in any sense arrogant or anything, but at this point in time, at a certain point in every artist's time, you need that time to do those pictures that you've always longed to do.
Yeah.
And so you're going to need the time, you're going to need the resources. And Bash Lepage, I think, said it best, and that's also in my book. They asked him the question, what is the most important thing? He said, concentration.
Wow. Yeah.
So the point is that, yes, I enjoy seeing on the various medium like Facebook or some of these other things what people are doing. It's fun to see.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the work is good and some of it is, a mixed bag. But um, for me to actually myself get involved would take so much time and effort, um, that it would actually just kind of hinder me from remembering where I was in the picture.
Sure. Yeah. And I think that's such an important point that you mentioned on what Lepage was saying about concentration, because yeah, like looking at all these different social media sites that showcase the work of current artists, it's very easy to start contradicting and questioning your own techniques and vision by thinking, is what you're doing adequate, or in regards to the training, there are so many different theories on the training. It's hard to stick to one kind of approach that you think works, but I think in the end you're just going to find something that works for you.
Well, the most important thing, as I think I wrote to you in an email, is you have to early on, as much as possible, find the best person to study with.
Yeah, yeah,
Absolutely the best possible person, so you can get a good footing and get moving, and then you have all those other things to contend with, which in some ways it's fun, but as Gamble used to say, you've got to have the intestinal fortitude to be a painter. It's a very high calling. It's a grand thing to be involved with. And you do meet a lot of great people. I had a period at one point, and this goes back to your just question here, where I didn't want to be around artists. I simply enjoyed my contacts with business people, and
yeah,
I met a lot of them, and they're all very successful. And I was very excited to hear how they made their fortunes and all the rest of it. And they were just as enthused to talk about art and all that kind of thing.
sure.
So then I had a period where I thought, yeah, I kind of miss a little bit of camaraderie. But as you just suggested, the hazard of that and getting this kind of group mentality is you start to go, well, is the group going to accept me if I do this or do that?
Yeah.
And you see that in some of the organizations I belong to, and it's not healthy for the mind. You have to be very strong.
That's right.
In where you're going, and then you're fine, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good advice, Alan. That's really good advice. Thank you. So my final question is just a basic description of your day-to-day routine. So when do you start painting? Is there anything else you do in between your time when you're painting? You mentioned via email that you're working on quite a lot of projects at the moment.
Yeah, I've got, for the last few years, I've had the good fortune of working with some clients who, are extremely well off, and they're able to have me do projects that they're interested in having done.
Sure.
And then as I do those, I also am able to finish up the what I would call my academic pictures, which I like getting into for a period of years. I've been working on a couple here for several years, and
Wow.
so I'm very anxious to kind of get those wrapped up as well. And so yeah, it's been good, and I can't remember how we started this, but anyway, that's all my day-to-day routine. Well, I basically in the mornings I like to catch up on what's going on as far as the internet goes and what's happening for my business that way. And then because my wife's also a painter,
Yeah.
we get together and have coffee in the war room. That's what I call it.
I see.
Winston Churchill. So what we would do is sit down and discuss what the projects we're working on. I like her opinion, and we exchange ideas about something. And I usually rotate the pictures. So I'll be working on one maybe for a couple of days and then get off it, because it's not healthy to have one picture, at least from my point of view. Only working on it until you get dry.
Yeah. I see.
So my routine basically is day to day. I take off Sundays.
Yeah.
I don't work Sunday. And then in the evening, I've been working on this book, so I'm trying to get that thing finished. And then that got me spurred on to writing more about some other artists I'm interested in. So whether I get through those or not, I don't know. The other thing that is kind of fascinating, as you're asking me questions, is there's so much richness of the time that I went through, which was like a struggle, but it was also almost an exciting time, because you could see in the end things were beginning to turn to our favor as artists. And the galleries now are accepting realism, and in fact now they're even courting a lot of the artists. So all those things are really good, healthy things, and I enjoy the stories, as you're doing with me and Darren and so forth, of what people have gone through, because people are interesting. I just find that no matter what they've done, I don't care if they're building a log cabin in the forest of Canada. Some guy doing that, and he writes about his own little personal stories. And I thought, well, that's more interesting to me than watching some sitcom.
Yeah. Good point. Good point. Just going back in regards to, you were saying the way that you start your day is with, you have coffee with your wife and you discuss what you're working on and such. I wanted to get your opinion on something. Are you familiar with the modernist artist Will Barnett? I should say the late modernist artist Will Barnett. He passed away several years ago.
Well, it sounds familiar to me.
Yeah. I mean, he was an American artist. He was quite big throughout his lifetime. But anyway, I'll get onto the point here. So in 2008, he was interviewed, and he was in his 90s. He lived right up until, I think it was about 98 or 99 years old. So the interviewer asked him what he thinks the most important thing is for an art student. Barnett's response was, find a wife. What do you think of his advice?
Wow, that's a good one. I would say, if you can find somebody like that shares your interests, that's a fantastic thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that comes right up there with helping you get your job done, your life's work.
Sure.
Yeah, I think I haven't heard that before, but it's an interesting statement. if you've got a partner um, that you can bounce things off of, I just think it's fabulous. In my life, it is.
Yeah.
I've had it where it wasn't that way, and it's pretty much kind of torturous because you're basically a painter 24 hours a day.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sometimes even in your sleep.
That's
So
right. Yeah.
you're trying to carve out your uh, godly gift and try to do it in such a way that you're giving the craft the credit it deserves and that you need to give it.
Yeah.
And so to have a partner, as you just mentioned, is really fabulous. And so to answer the other part of your question about having coffee and all that, I just find it so stimulating to wake up in the morning and have that. So what you just said about whatever that artist was,
Yeah.
is really a good point.
Yeah, yeah, sure. And yeah, I mean, I guess we're getting a bit philosophical now, but just the idea of, you know, being an artist and really trying to improve your craft and getting caught up in that, it's so healthy just to have that, significant other that you can connect with and talk about, your struggles in the studio and what's going on and things like that. Yeah, but that's very, very, very good advice, Alan. Thanks for sharing that. So basically, that's the end of my questions. I just wanted to ask, was there anything else that you wanted to touch on or something that you think we didn't get into that you would like to perhaps bring up?
I can't think of anything offhand, but you're welcome to email if there is something that comes up.
Sure, sure.
Basically, I can just say this. I'm very pleased that artists today and talents today are able to get some decent training in general.
Yeah.
And it's up to them to really work it hard.
Mm-hmm.
And, then there's a whole host of things that go into living the life and everything, but we'll have to cover that under either in a book or some other way.
Yeah, yeah.
But in general, just the fact that you and I are talking and communicating from across the world,
Mm-hmm.
and that we all both know, and others that you've talked to, can genuinely really love the work that's come before,
Mm-hmm.
and that they set a standard that is so wonderful that we all want to embrace that, make it our own, and hopefully make the world a little bit better in the future.
That's lovely. Lovely advice, Alan. Thank you. Do we have a date for the book release, your book on Gamma?
Um, not a date, but we'll post everything so you'll know ahead of time.
Yeah, sure, sure.
And what we're doing now is just really fine tuning some of it. We're trying to work with a couple of institutions to get their permission to do some extra whole master reproductions,
Right.
and it takes a little bit of time.
It does, yeah, yeah.
But it's really pretty much there. We're just cleaning things up a little bit more.
Great, great.
Making sure I don't say this instead of that or something.
Sure, sure. Yeah. No, I definitely look forward to the release of that book. So yeah, I'll be waiting enthusiastically for that to come out. So what I'll do, Alan, is I'll send you a copy of this audio interview, and you can do with it what you like. If you'd like to share it with your colleagues, that's fine. I'll be putting this interview on my website to help raise awareness about the contemporary realist art movement, and the quality of the work that's coming out from different parts of the world and such. Yeah, so I'll get that to you hopefully today at some point. Other than that, I just wanted to say thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me today. It's really incredible to be able to speak with someone like you that's part of the Gamma-Lack lineage and that's had the life that you've had thus far, and how dedicated you are to your work. So I just wanted to say thank you very much for doing what you're doing and being that example for like younger art students like me, to have people like you and your colleagues to look up to. And a lot of your work, believe it or not, has helped me in those early days of art school when I was a bit confused about why art was the way it was. And I would read these articles that you and some of your colleagues had written, and it really gave me clarity and insight into understanding how this art has survived through lineage. And I quickly came to understand that it's only certain patches in the world that have this belief still, and that the contemporary art establishment really has a different belief. So yeah, thank you very much for everything you've done.
Well, it's been nice talking to you as well, and I'm enthused that we have people from across the globe who are, really helping others to highlight the area that we need to highlight.
Yeah.
So, I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to talk with you as well.
Well, thank you, Alan. It's been my pleasure. Is there a website that people can look at your work or contact you on?
Yeah, you've got allanrbanks.com,
Mm-hmm.
SALLAN,
Yeah,
and also that's allanbanks.com. So I got both of those.
both of those. Okay. And people can send you an email via that website?
Yeah.
Sure, sure. Great. Sure thing. Okay, great. Alan, it's been great. It's been fantastic. Thank you again for taking the time to speak with me today. And this audio interview will be sent to you at some point later on today. Thank you very much.
Sounds great. Thank you.
No worries. See you later.
Okay.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.